Hello, this is Dr. John Davenport, and as the Chief Compliance Officer for Compliance and Auditing Services, I want to welcome you to this tutorial on transitioning your office to ICD-10. As members, you should have already gotten your ICD-10 CM checklist, as well as your top 175 codes for chiropractic offices so that you can do your crosswalk and get the correct codes that you need to be using. You should have also gotten the links that we'll be talking about during this presentation, which also enable you to crosswalk your codes using a GEMS list over to your tabular list so you can make sure that you have the correct code to use. Before we get started, I want you to just take a deep breath and understand that even though you've heard many horror stories about ICD-10, it's not that difficult to understand, and I'm here to guide you through the process step by step. I assure you that you have plenty of time to prepare your office for the transition as long as you take action now. As always, Compliance and Auditing Services is here to help you, and you can always call us with any questions or concerns that you may have. So let's get started. ICD-10 stands for the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, 10th revision. The short name is International Classification of Diseases, ICD-10. The collection of statistical information related to healthcare is nothing new. In fact, in 1860, Florence Nightingale proposed the first model of systematic collection of hospital data. In 1900, the first international conference was held to develop the first revision of the ICD, and this was called ICD-1. But since that time, most civilized countries throughout the world have been using the classification of diseases to report mortality statistics. The last revision of the International Classification of Diseases was in 1999, and presently the World Health Organization is currently working on revisions from ICD-10 towards ICD-11, and the final draft for ICD-11 is expected to be submitted for endorsement in 2017. But this shouldn't worry you because the changes they're going to make are just going to be adding more codes to the code system itself. And these changes should have little effect, if any, on chiropractic offices. As you know, the government, and especially the Department of Health and Human Services, places a great demand on the importance of coded data. This is because they want to use this data to develop and assess ways to measure value-based purchasing, quality performance, practice standards and quality measures, outcome measures, and importantly, utilization reviews, disease management and research, and my favorites, population management and biosurveillance. So how is ICD-10 different from ICD-9? ICD-10 codes allow for greater specificity and exactness and will allow for new diagnostic codes and procedures as they develop. It also allows for performance-based payment systems, and you might have already heard of best practices, where they statistically determine the amounts of time that a specific condition should take to get better and give physicians incentives for getting that condition better earlier or decrease the amount of reimbursement if it takes longer for the condition to improve. Additionally, the new ICD-10 codes provide for more accurate billing and makes the billing process more streamlined and efficient. And it's important to note that the gathering of these statistics also allows for a more precise method of detecting fraud. ICD-10 represents a significant improvement over ICD-9 in that it increased the chapters from 17 to 21 chapters, which I'll go over that in just a second. It has the inclusion of the external causes code. Injuries are now grouped by anatomic site and by the type of injury. They also expanded the code categories and added a seventh character for episodes of care, which I'll also review. And then they included the trimesters in obstetrics codes, added standard definitions for two types of excludes notes, which we'll review, and increased the specificity of the clinical detail to improve coding accuracy. On this slide, you'll see that they did expand the number of chapters from 19 to 21, but really all they did was add in two chapters, one for ear and eye, which in general will have no effect on chiropractic offices. This slide is important to understand because with ICD-10, they added the seventh character, or what they call an extension code. These codes are scattered throughout the ICD-10, but for chiropractors, you're going to mainly see it in Chapter 19, the code on injuries. The seventh character codes you're going to see in the tabular list are A for initial encounter, D for subsequent encounter, and S for sequela. To make it easy to understand, let me further define each character and what it means. As I said, the A character stands for initial encounter, and this means that the patient is receiving active treatment for the condition. The D, subsequent encounter, means that the patient is receiving routine care for the condition. So they will see the D character as being maintenance care when it comes to chiropractic treatment. So if you code the D, usually your claims will be denied because they will consider this maintenance care. The S, or sequela, is predominantly used for medical conditions and by medical offices and will not be used by chiropractic physicians. It typically is related to complications or conditions that arise as a direct result of a condition. So for example, if a patient received a burn and they were treated for that burn, and because of the burn they developed a significant scar, later on they may go back to another physician, such as a plastic surgeon, to treat the scar. So for chiropractors, they will always use the A, initial encounter. At seminars, doctors often ask me, what if the patient comes back in 3 months with the same condition? Wouldn't that mean that they would code the D for subsequent encounter? And my answer is no. D stands for maintenance care. A stands for active care. This means for reimbursement purposes, if a seventh character is required, a chiropractor will always use the character A in the seventh position. Now in the tabular list, when you're looking up your code, you'll see that they will actually let you know that they need a seventh character to further define that code. So in this example, in Chapter 19 under S13, subluxation, which is traumatic, you'll see just above the code that they're asking you to add a seventh character. The seventh character must always be in the seventh character data field. What this means is that if a code requires a seventh character and it is not 6 characters in length, a placeholder X must be used to fill in the empty characters. So what I mean by this is that the placeholder X is really a dummy placeholder, and it's used in certain codes to allow for future expansion. The X itself is not case sensitive, and when the placeholder character applies, It has to be used in order for the code to be valid. So for example, the X placeholder is usually either in positions 4, 5, or 6. Here in the example, you'll see SO3.0XXA, dislocation of the jaw, comma, initial encounter. So they're requesting that you use a 7th character code, and for chiropractors, that code will always be A. But you'll see that the code for dislocation of the jaw is only 4 characters in length. So to fill in the extra 2 characters so that you can have the 7th character A, you would put XX. Here are 2 other examples which apply more to chiropractic. You have S13.4XXA, sprain of the cervical spine ligaments, initial encounter, and then S13.5XXA, sprain of the lumbar spine ligaments, initial encounter. So here again you see that the tabular list asks you for a 7th character, but these characters are only 4 characters in length. So to fill in the space between the 4th character and the 7th character A, you would put XX as a placeholder. Because of the changes in increased specificity, doctors will need to improve their documentation of the diagnosis and treatment procedures, because the codes must be supported by the patient's records. And since the codes are more specific, more documentation will be required to support the codes used. The American Academy of Professional Coders stated that they expect a 15% increase in the time required to meet the new insurance requirements. In addition, changes will be made in insurance coverage policies and reimbursement to accommodate the increased specificity. More than 65% of the time, the notes may not be specific enough to meet the new requirements, and unspecified codes will lead to delayed payment or all-out denial of payments. With that said, you can expect increased rejections, denials, and payment delays as providers and carriers get used to the new coding. In fact, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services recognize that the transition to ICD-10 will have an effect on the physician's payment processes, and the agency estimates that in the early stages of implementation, denial rates could rise as high as 100 to 200%. Now, I don't expect that to be true, but it is important that you position your practice so that it can withstand any payment delays. In fact, the Healthcare Financial Management Association stated that practices should have at least 3 to 6 months worth of cash on hand before the first day of October in case of any payment bottlenecks. Now, turning to the new HCFA form, which is really not so new, the National Uniform Claim Committee adopted it because it needed to change to match the requirements for the electronic format and the use of the ICD-10 codes. The reason the form is not so new is that in January of 2014, healthcare plans and clearinghouses were required to start using the form, and then April 1st of 2014, providers were also required to start using the form, so you should already be using the form right now. The most notable changes to the HCFA claim form is that in box 21, they expanded the possible number of diagnoses to 12, and they removed the period within the diagnosis code line. And this is because the period is in the actual diagnostic code. The next important change is the ICD-10 indicator. It was added for differentiating between the ICD-9 and ICD-10 diagnostic codes. So if you look where the circle is, you'll see ICD-10 indicator. So in that box, if you're billing an ICD-9 code, you would put the 9 in that position. Now, the reasons you might bill an ICD-9 code is that you may have submitted payment for bills after October 1st, which were where the services were performed prior to October 1st. So you would still use the ICD-9 code. Or you may have been denied payment for billing and you would have to resubmit your bills. So if you resubmitted your bills and these bills were from prior to October 1st, you would go ahead and still submit them as an ICD-9 code. Now, after October 1st, all the billing should be in ICD-10 format, and in that case, in the ICD-10 indicator box, you would put 0, which would indicate that the billing is on ICD-10. It's important to understand, though, that you cannot bill an ICD-9 code and an ICD-10 code on the same claim form, or it will be denied. Now, most of your EHR vendors have upgraded their computer software system to enable you to go ahead and auto-populate that according to the insurance carrier, whether you're using an ICD-9 or an ICD-10 code. So it's important to understand that, and let me say this very clearly, the automobile insurance as well as the workers' comp insurance are not converting to ICD-10. They will remain on ICD-9. So again, it's important to understand this little fact about the ICD-10 indicator, and you should check with your software vendor to make sure that your system can auto-populate between ICD-9 and ICD-10. Now let's take a look at how the ICD-10 codes are organized. Here's a code, W59.22XA, struck by a turtle initial encounter. I'm not sure if you'll ever use that in practice, but if you ever need it, be assured that they do have that code. The ICD-10 codes are 3 to 7 digits in length. The decimal is always used after the third character, and the first digit is an alpha digit, and it is not case sensitive. Digits 2 and 3 are always numeric, and then digits 4 through 7 can be alpha or numeric. But remember, we talked about the 7th character or the 7th character extension, which for chiropractors will always be an A. So in this example of reduced cervical curvature, you'll see the first 3 letters. The first one is an M, so it's alpha. The next 2 are numeric, and then the decimal is after the third character, and then followed by the number 4. The 3 character codes are the core classification of ICD-10, and these are called blocks, and these blocks represent a single condition or disease in the tabular list. If a 3 character category or block has no further subdivision, it is equal to a code. But this is very rare, and I doubt that you will ever see this or use it because most codes require further subdivision to make the code more specific. So to further give you an example, you'll see here in Chapter 13, Diseases of the Musculoskeletal System and Connective Tissue, which chiropractors are mainly going to use this chapter as well as the injury chapter, Chapter 19. But what you see here is the blocks. So you'll see that you have the alpha code followed by 2 numerical codes, and they're describing specific conditions. So for example, osteoarthritis would be in the block M15 to M19. To further give you an example, in this slide, you see that the ICD code again is divided into the block, which is A, with a decimal point, and then B would be your subclassification, so that further describes the condition within that category. And again, C would be the extension for the 7th character, which is almost exclusively used with injuries. And for chiropractors, again, I repeat, that will always be an A. So in this example, S93.401A, sprain of unspecified ligament of the right ankle, initial encounter. When you go to your tabular list, you'll see in the white box underneath, that's what you'll see. And you'll see that you have the block S93, which would deal with sprains. Then the .4 tells you that it's a sprain of the ankle. Now underneath that, you'll see that you have a choice between the right ankle or the left ankle, which is much more specific than the unspecified code, which is the 40. So in this case, you would use the S93.401, indicating that it is a sprain of a ligament of the right ankle. So to simplify everything that we just discussed and pull it all together, in the tabular list, you'll go to the chapter, which for chiropractors will be chapter 13 or chapter 19. And then in the chapters, you'll find the blocks or the categories. And these are the specific conditions. So you'll go to the specific conditions, and underneath that, you'll see the subcategories or the subclassifications. And that's where you'll find the specific code that you need to use to code that diagnosis. In ICD-10, the subcategories define the site, etiology, and the manifestation of the disease. So you're going to use the block plus the decimal point and then a fourth digit, which will identify the condition at a higher level of specificity. And so the more specific the code, the more likely you're going to get paid and the code will not be denied. In this example, you see M99.4, which means subluxation complex of the vertebra. In this example, you see the tabular list, and in this case, you see that you have M99.1 of the vertebra, but you can further define that subclassification to M99.11, which would mean subluxation complex of the vertebra of the cervical region. So in this case, it's a 5-character code, and it has a much higher level of specificity and therefore is more likely to get paid. In the next example, you see a 6-character code, the M75.100, which means unspecified rotator cuff tear. And to be more specific, you would go down in the tabular list and further define that code from unspecified to either the right shoulder or the left shoulder. And if you see the 1 means right, and generally 2 means the left shoulder. So 99% of the time for chiropractic offices, 1 equals right, 2 equals left. So in this example, you see pain in the right hip versus pain in the left hip. And remember, there are no bilateral codes. Now it's time to look at the conventions for ICD-10. Think of conventions as the general rules for the use of the classification. You'll see these rules or conventions throughout the tabular list, and they're used as instructional notes. The first one to look at would be the includes note. And you'll see that the includes note appears immediately under a 3-character code title, and it further defines or gives examples of the content of the category. So in this case, certain infectious or parasitic diseases, A00 through B99 includes diseases generally recognized as communicable or transmittable. So under the block of A00 to B99 for infectious and parasitic diseases, that would also include diseases generally recognized as communicable or transmittable. More important to us would be the excludes notes 1 and 2. So there's two types of excludes note, and each one has a different definition for use, but both indicate that the codes are excluded from each other and are independent of each other. So looking at excludes 1, this instruction tells you when two conditions cannot occur together. Any codes here are off limits. That means that they're purely excluded and that the two conditions cannot be reported together. So in the example, you see sciatica, and underneath you'll see excludes 1. So on the tabular list, the instructions are right there in front of you. They're not hidden. So when you're looking for the codes, you'll see it right there. So in this example of sciatica, you'll see that the excludes 1 would include lesion of the sciatic nerve, or sciatica due to intervertebral disc disorder, or sciatica with lumbago. So these conditions cannot occur together and you could not code them together. But you'll also see that in the excludes 1, these are more specific to the cause of the sciatica. In this next slide, you see the ICD-9 code 724.2, meaning lumbago. And that's a category 1 under Medicare. So what that means is that for lumbago, or just pain in the lumbar region, they will look at that and determine that that should be improved within a certain period of time, usually a lesser period of time than, say, low back strain or lumbago due to intervertebral displacement. So in actuality, the excludes 1 note, when you find the code, if you look under the tabular list, for example, M54.5, low back pain, you'll see that that's a category 1 code. But the excludes 1 list underneath it gives you other examples like low back strain or lumbago due to intervertebral disc displacement or lumbago with sciatica. All of these are class 2 codes, which means with the insurance companies that it will probably take longer for these conditions to improve, giving you more time to treat the patient if your documentation can support it. So when you see an excludes 1 note, don't look at it as a bad thing, but use it to see if there is a better diagnosis that is more specific and better describes the condition of the patient. In addition, this lets the insurance company know that the condition is more serious and that it will take longer for the patient's condition to improve. This can give you more time to treat the patient before the insurance companies request documentation to support the treatment that you're rendering. The excludes 2 code is different because what it is meaning is that the patient may have both conditions at the same time. The excluded code and the code above the excludes code can be used together if the documentation supports it. So in this example of S13.1 subluxation and dislocation of the cervical vertebra, underneath it, it says excludes fracture of the cervical vertebra. So if the patient suffered an injury where they had a fracture of the cervical vertebra as well as a subluxation or dislocation of the cervical vertebra, you could use the 2 codes together if the documentation supports it. So in this next slide, in the tabular list block, you see M53.1, cervical brachial syndrome. And what that means is that the patient has shoulder or arm pain of an unknown etiology. Underneath that, though, you see excludes 2, where you would see cervical disc disorder. So in this example, you could code both of those codes together if the documentation supports it. So if the cervical brachial syndrome was actually caused by a cervical disc disorder, you could then use both of those codes together. To give you an even better example, we have M25.519, pain in unspecified shoulder. Underneath that, in the tabular list, you'll see pain in hand, pain in fingers, pain in foot, pain in limb, pain in toes. But for this example, we're going to use the pain in the limb, and I'm going to show you how the two codes can be used together if the documentation supports them. So in this slide, the patient presents with a chief complaint of right shoulder and right upper arm pain for 2 weeks in duration since carrying his 2-year-old daughter at Disney World for 12 hours. So the example here would be M25.51, pain in the right shoulder, and remember the 1 means right, and then M79.62, pain in the right upper arm. So even though this is an exclude code, the code above the exclude code can be used together if, once again, the documentation supports it. Moving on to the code also, what this convention or instruction is telling you in the tabular list is that more than one code may be required to fully describe the condition. In this case, the note does not provide sequencing. The sequencing of the code depends on the severity or the reason for the encounter. And we'll go over this when we discuss hierarchy of codes in just a second. But in this example, S16, injury of muscle, fascia, and tendon at the neck level, code also any associated open wound. And that would be found in S11. So if the patient had an injury to the muscle, fascia, or tendon of the neck, say a sprained strain, and when they were injured, they also suffered an open wound, or if the open wound was the reason for the injury to the muscle, fascia, or tendon, you could code those two codes together. And again, in S16, you'll also see excludes 2, sprain of the joint or ligament at the neck level. So you could also use that code together with injury of muscle, fascia, and tendon at the neck level, again, if your documentation supports it. And again, underneath that, you'll see that they're telling you that because it was an injury, and it's in the S section or injury section, chapter 19, the appropriate 7th character is to be added to each code from category S16. And so for that, as I've said before, you would use the A. So chiropractors will always use the A if it asks for a 7th character. The next instruction you might see in the tabular list is code first, use additional code. So what this means is that both an underlying cause and multiple body systems manifestations due to the underlying etiology. So this signals that an additional code should be reported to provide a more complete picture of the diagnosis. So that you're not confused, let me give you this example. The use additional code note will be the etiology code, and the code first note means that it would be the manifestation code. So they indicate the proper sequencing order of the codes, meaning etiology followed by manifestation. So to make this simple, let's say that you're treating a patient for diabetic neuropathy. Well, that's the manifestation, but the cause for the diabetic neuropathy or the etiology would be type 2 diabetes. So in this case, in the tabular list, under diabetic neuropathy, you would see code first, use additional code. So you would want to then use the type 2 diabetes, which would be the etiology first. Remember, we're talking sequencing here. And then diabetic neuropathy second, which is the manifestation. Now, the next slide talks about Chapter 20, External Causes of Morbidity. And this is an interesting chapter and very easy to understand because it has very little impact on you as a chiropractor. But these codes capture how the injury or health condition happened, the cause of it, the intent, whether it was intentional or unintentional, such as suicide and intentional, or the place where the event occurred, the activity the patient at the time of the event, and the person's status, such as whether they were in a civilian or whether they were in the military. And most often you will see this used with Chapter 19 codes. Now, just for fun, let me give you an example. You have a 30-year-old patient that was at a sports gymnasium participating in a tap dancing contest to raise funds for a charity. She slipped on the gym floor and fell, injuring her left ankle. The ankle was x-rayed and no fracture was evident. Her ankle was wrapped in an ACE bandage and she was given proper RICE instructions, and she will follow up with her primary care physician. So in this case, using the codes from Chapter 20, you would first use the diagnosis, which is the sprain strain of the left ankle. And if you see there S9 3.402, 2 means left. And because it was an injury, you'd want to use the 7th extension character as an A for chiropractors. And then after you've listed the principal diagnosis, then you would list the sequence of events based on the codes. So in this case, your principal would be your diagnosis, and then the cause would be a slip and fall. The place would be at a sports gymnasium, and the activity would be dancing. And then the status of the patient would be volunteer activity. But don't worry about Chapter 20. Let me tell you the facts about Chapter 20. And this is directly from the Department of Health and Human Services, Centers for Medicare and Medicare Services. If you have not been reporting ICD-9 external cause codes, you will not be required to report ICD-10 codes found in Chapter 20 unless a new state or payer-based requirement about the reporting of these codes is instituted. If such a requirement is instituted, it would be independent of ICD-10 implementation. So what they're telling you there is that even though it would be nice for you to use these codes and use Chapter 20, you don't have to. And if you haven't been doing it in the past, and most, if not all, chiropractors have not been using the external cause codes, you are not required to do so. So in other words, just forget about it. So now let me show you how you can easily find the codes that you're going to want to use in your office. The bad news is that compared to ICD-9, there are about 65,000 more codes in the new code set. But the good news is that you're probably only ever going to use just a handful of those codes. Identifying the ICD-10 right equivalent of an ICD-9 code can be challenging. And that's because ICD-10 is significantly more specific than ICD-9. And there are many instances in which a single ICD-9 code has several ICD-10 correlations. So the crosswalking tools may not give you the most accurate code conversion, and that's important to understand. To get started, the best way to prepare for the transition is to create a list of the new codes you know you're going to need to use in your office. So these are the codes that you use the most. So first you want to identify the codes you use on a regular basis. And then second, you want to put together the resources that you're going to need to convert the codes on your list. Here are some examples. You have the Chiro code ICD-10 coding for chiropractic, which is about $134 with tax. Then you have the AAPC ICD-10 CM coding, which again is about $100. And then you have the top 175 codes for chiropractic offices, which I provided you as a member to make it even easier for you to crosswalk your codes so you can identify the correct codes that you need to be using. Other resources you can get free from the internet, and I did send you these links already, are the findacode.com, which I don't particularly like. It's a little bit more confusing, and the AAPC crosswalk, which that's the one I prefer to use, and that's the one that I sent you. And then finally, you're going to need a copy of the tabular list, which is provided with the other link that I sent you that you see here at the bottom, which is directly from Medicare. So how do you translate codes from ICD-9 to ICD-10? Well, you start with a familiar ICD-9 code, then you use the general equivalence mappings, which is called GEMS, to translate the code into an approximate ICD-10 code. So you use the tabular list to locate the appropriate ICD-10 code once you've used the GEMS to translate the code over to an approximate code. As I said, GEMS are a general mapping between the ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes. To map from ICD-9 to ICD-10 is to translate from one code set, the ICD-9 code set, to the ICD-10 code set, and this is sometimes called crosswalking. It's important to understand that while the GEMS provide a useful code-to-code reference between the two code sets, the translation is not always exact. So the purpose of the GEMS is to provide a preliminary transition between the code sets. So this is very, very important to understand. GEMS are only a helpful starting point in finding a code. Often there's not a one-to-one match between the codes, and many matches are only mapped to unspecific codes. So it's necessary for you to review the codes in the tabular list to determine the most appropriate code match. Now, even though the EHR systems or your software systems are sometimes set up to automatically match between codes, these are still considered GEMS. So make sure you check with your vendor, your software vendor, to see if they do convert over. But when they do convert over, just remember that that is considered a gem. So you still have to go to the tabular list to further narrow down to the code that you want to use. Here is an example of general equivalence mapping using the link that I sent you from AAPC. The example here is 719.46, pain in joint, lower leg. So if you enter this code into the conversion tool and then press go, it'll translate it over to M25.569, pain in unspecified knee. Now, while this may be technically correct, it is definitely not the right code to use. You should document which knee the patient is experiencing the pain in. So for this example, let's say it's the right knee. And if you fail to code this pertinent information, it will result in a claim rejection. Most of the time, unspecified codes are going to be rejected. So in the example of this slide, the M25.569 pain in unspecified knee, to find the most correct code, you're going to have to open the tabular list and go to chapter 13. Then you will find M25.56, the knee pain category, and read through the subsequent options that include the laterality. And when you see it, you'll see M25.561, and remember 1 means right knee, and M25.562, and that means pain in the left knee. So 1 means right knee, 2 means left knee. So in this case, the correct code would be M25.561, pain in the right knee. And if you'll also note that this is a 6-character code, so it has the highest level of specificity, and that's important because that code will most likely not be denied. So again, when you go to the tabular list in chapter 13, while you're browsing the new code set, you want to pay attention to the instructions at the top of each chapter and of each category. So in this example here, you'll see sciatica, and you'll see excludes 1. And remember, excludes 1 means that the two codes cannot be used together. So the excludes 1 can direct you to a better code that you can use, which is more specific to the reason for the cause of the sciatica. So in this instance, you'll see sciatica due to intervertebral disc disorder, which would be a lot more specific, and it would also increase the complexity of the condition, notifying the insurance company that this condition may take longer to improve, giving you more time to treat the patient. As a side note, it's important to understand that you cannot use the diagnosis of intervertebral disc disorder unless you have an MRI or CT scan which proves that there is a disc disorder. The same thing with degenerative disc disease. It's a complicating factor, and the only way that you can use it to diagnose a condition of higher complexity is if you have an x-ray that shows degenerative disc disease. To review and pull everything together, I've developed the confusion solution so that you can understand step by step what you need to do to find the appropriate ICD-10 code that you're looking for and that you want to use. The first step is to start with the general equivalence mappings. This is where you're going to crosswalk your ICD-9 code to your ICD-10 code in the tabular list. Now I prefer the AAPC as opposed to find a code, and I've sent you the link for AAPC already so that you can use it. So you'll take the ICD-9 code, put it in the box, and then push go, and it will give you the general equivalent of the ICD-10 code. Then from there, you'll go to the tabular list of diseases and injuries with the ICD-10 code. And these codes, again, are based on body systems and conditions. There are 21 chapters, but as a chiropractor, you're going to use chapter 13 and chapter 19 mainly. Using the link that I've already sent you, you will go to the tabular list using the ICD-10 equivalent code and find the block where it's located. Remember that the code blocks are equal to a letter, and two numbers. So for example, in Chapter 13, diseases of the musculoskeletal system and connective tissue, the blocks would be divided into M00 to M99. The next step, once you've found the block where the code is located, you will review the subcategories, and under the subcategories you may find notes such as code also or excludes or the seventh character extension, which I talked to you about. So you can use these to consider the appropriateness of the code you were considering. And remember that these are instructions, but they may steer you away from the code you are considering and offer suggestions on a more appropriate code to use instead. Know that ICD-10-CM codes should be listed at their highest level of specificity and character, and make sure that you code all conditions that exist at the time of the visit that require or affect patient care. And understand it is inappropriate to select a specific code that is not supported by the health record documentation. And always remember that you want to use the tabular list to select the appropriate diagnostic code. So if your EHR system will allow you to crosswalk, it's not giving you a specific code. What it is doing is it's giving you a GEM code or general equivalent code. So it's your duty to go to the tabular list to make the final decision. Remember, we talked about the specificity of the condition. So in other words, if it's the right knee, you want to say that it's the right knee. If it's the left knee, you want to say that it's the left knee. Now, when we get into sequencing of the ICD-10 codes, the diagnosis that you provide directly relates to the level of care permitted by the third-party payers. What this means is that the higher the complexity of the code that you use will determine the length of time that the insurance company will allow you to treat the patient before they request documentation to support the length of treatment that you are providing the patient. So on this slide, you will see the hierarchy or the optimal sequencing of the codes. The first would be the neurological diagnosis, such as sciatica or suboccipital neuritis or radiculitis, or possibly a disc disorder. The next would be structural, which would be degenerative disc disease. The next would be functional diagnosis, such as deconditioning syndrome or restricted range of motion. Then soft tissues such as sprain strains, myofasciitis, muscle spasm, or fibromyalgia. Pain would be the last diagnosis that you would want to use sequentially. And normally I don't use the pain diagnosis because pain in and of itself is not necessarily a diagnosis, and they consider that a Tylenol diagnosis, meaning that the patient could go down to the store and just buy Tylenol for their pain. So that would be a diagnosis they would give you the least amount of time to treat before they requested documentation. Now that we have reviewed all the steps necessary to find the correct ICD-10 code that you will need to use, let me share with you a simple strategy that Compliance and Auditing Services has designed to help our members find the exact codes that they need. With this book, the top 175 chiropractic codes that all members have received, it will enable you to crosswalk your codes without having to go back and forth between a GEMS tool and the tabular list. All of our members have already received this book, but if you are not a member, you can go to the complianceman.com to receive a copy. In this slide, I want to show you how you can use the top 175 codes book to find the exact code that you need. In this example, We have Miss Jones. She has a chief complaint of low back pain that radiates into the right hip and right leg. Radiographs have determined that she has degenerative disc disease at L5S1, and this is considered a complicating factor. Remember, we talked about the hierarchy of codes. And we also diagnosed her with an L5 subluxation with asymmetry right. Based on the exam and the x-rays, it led us to the diagnosis of lumbar degenerative disc disease, L5 subluxation, iliotibial band syndrome, and myospasm of the lumbar spine. And these are the ICD-9 codes that would correspond to those diagnoses. By using the Compliance and Auditing Services book, you can easily find the ICD-9 codes because they are in numerical order. Once you found the code, then you can look to the right and see the corresponding ICD-10 code. And to the far right of the ICD-10 code, you will see the definition of that specific code and any special instructions that are associated with that specific code. So if you look at what we have based on Mrs. Jones, you'll see degeneration of lumbar or lumbosacral intervertebral disc. The code would be M51.37 in the ICD-10 coding, meaning other intervertebral disc degeneration, lumbosacral region. The next would be muscle spasm, M62.830, muscle spasm of the back. The next would be M76.3, iliotibial band syndrome. And you see here that you have two instructions. First, to make the code more specific, you need to determine whether it is the right leg or the left leg. The second is an excludes two code, which if you remember, that means that you can use both codes together if your documentation supports it. And in this case, iliotibial band syndrome usually carries with it bursitis of the supratrochanteric bursa. Then finally, for the subluxation, you have M99.03, and it's specific because it shows you that it means segmental and somatic dysfunction of the lumbar region, so it's specific to the lumbar region. Using the hierarchy of coding for insurance companies, and then in Florida and Connecticut for Medicare, you would list the ICD-10 codes in this order. M51.37, lumbosacral degenerative disc disease. You put that first because it's a complicating factor. M99.03, L5 subluxation, because that's a structural diagnosis. M76.31, iliotibial band syndrome, right leg, remember the 1 means right leg. And then M62.830, muscle spasm of the back. And then you're done. Now for Medicare in all other states except Florida and Connecticut, you would list it in this order because a subluxation has to be listed first. So you would have the M99.03, L5 subluxation. Then next you would have the complicating factor of lumbosacral degenerative disc disease, and then iliotibial band syndrome of the right leg, and then muscle spasm of the back. As you can see, the Compliance and Auditing Services coding book is a much more simpler and faster way to convert your ICD-9 codes to your ICD-10 codes. Finally, you have plenty of time to prepare for the transition. All you have to do is take action and follow these step-by-step instructions. First, check with all of your vendors and make sure your systems are ready for the transition from ICD-9 to ICD-10. Second, you want to review how and where your office uses ICD-9 codes and create a list of the ICD-9 codes you use the most. Once you've done this, take your ICD-9 code list and using the Compliance and Auditing Services coding book, convert your ICD-9 codes over to your ICD-10 codes. The Compliance and Auditing Services coding book makes it easy because the ICD-9 codes are in numerical order, and the coding book also explains the conventions, which are the general rules for the use of the ICD-10 codes. Next, estimate and secure a budget because of the potential costs, which would include updates to the practice management system and any government payment delays. No one believes it will be a seamless transition. Ideally, have a cash reserve of at least 3 months operating expenses so that your practice can continue to operate normally and be able to weather any payment delays as a result of the transition. Discuss implementation plans with all of your clearinghouses, billing services, and payers to ensure a smooth transition. And then finally, work on your documentation. The single biggest challenge for ICD-10 will not come from coding, but from accurately documenting your services to match the new codes. ICD-10 codes are much more specific, and your documentation will need to improve to match them. This is important because if the insurance carriers ask for documentation to justify the codes, poor documentation will only slow the process down or result in all-out denials. To conclude, keep an eye out for any updates from Compliance and Auditing Services so that you can stay alert for more changes. As a Compliance and Auditing Services client, you are a valued part of our family and you do matter to us. We're here to help you and you can contact us at any time with questions. So right now, just focus on these steps that we've given you in preparing your office for ICD-10, and then don't sweat it, because with our help, the transition to ICD-10 will be an easy one. Thank you.